Well, hello. Since we don't have class this week, I thought that I would talk a little bit about some of the readings that you've been doing and your responses, and give you a little bit of the flavor of the kinds of discussions we might have had if class was not canceled due to Veterans Day. So I had you reading a couple of tale types for this week. One of them was the Little Red Riding Hood tale types, and we looked at those in class already. I did want to comment after reading your responses a little bit about those. Um, One thing that people said many times over and over again was that they didn't like these versions as well as, say, the original. Well, there's a problem there because remember we talked in class that original doesn't really apply to fairy tales because it's really hard to trace back to a single originary tale. So what instead happens is we have these variants, and most of the time when people say something in a response like "I like the original better," what they mean is "I like the one that I first heard better." Okay, well that's pretty natural. People like things to be the way that they're used to them being. So anyway. I just wanted to comment about that the original, if you say I like the original best, the thing that's closest to the original is probably whatever the oldest tale is. In the Little Red Riding Hood series, that would be the story of Grandmother. Okay, so that's the one where she does the little striptease and things. Most people didn't like that best. A lot of people also commented about like the notion of I wouldn't read these to my children. Okay, well remember that the group presentation talked about how the notion of childhood has changed and changed in really dramatic ways over the years. So it's not really fair to make that sort of assessment that that you can't necessarily consider that the audience for some of these was children because it wasn't. And so it's not fair to say these are bad because they are inappropriate for children, because that doesn't really make any sense. That's like saying, an X-rated movie is bad because it's inappropriate for children. It's not intended for children, right? So it's probably. I mean, it's not that. I don't disagree with you about those points. I'm just saying that if you look at it from a sort of scholarly point of view, then you're kind of ignoring some of the things that are important to consider, like the intended audience. Okay. At any rate, I did want to point out that on those Little Red Riding Hood stories, there tends to be two directions that the stories take. One of which ends up with the Little Red Riding Hood character, regardless of the name that she's given in the story, succeeding and sort of escaping by virtue of her own wits. And we see that in things like the false grandmother and Goldflower and the story of grandmother, all of those where the child uses generally this bathroom ploy. I need to go to the bathroom, so let me out for a little bit and then I'll come back. And of course she runs away when she's let out. Whether it's let out by a bear or an ogress or a wolf, doesn't matter. It's the same story trajectory. Now the thing that's interesting is that story has not really stuck around. That story has kind of disappeared. And what the story that has stuck around is one that instead has her being saved by some external agent of some kind, like the woodcutter or something. And so that's an interesting thing to just kind of consider. So what sort of I guess the question to ask is whose interests are served by having that story be the one that stays around, because it takes away like a child's ability to control his or her life, or to make successful choices about things, or what have you, and instead puts that into the hands of some external person. And so there's a kind of cultural sensibility that says that children need saving. They are not capable of doing things on their own, and so we need to do something for them. And that's a social attitude that's one that we try to, I think, maintain. And it's in some ways, it's a matter of like security, making our children safe, but in other ways it's a matter of sort of maintaining control in some ways over our children. So it's not a good thing or a bad thing necessarily. It's just a thing that's worth thinking about more carefully. Now, several people also, I wanted to comment about the images that were in the online gallery thing that I asked you to look at regarding Little Red Riding Hood, and many of you were sort of disturbed by those as well, and I completely understand that because they're fairly gruesome and or over sexualized or whatever, those kind of things. But what I wanted to say is that, lots of people have made this conclusion that, well, that's because in our society now we're overly violent, overly sexualized, overly whatever. But if we look back to the earliest versions of Little Red Riding Hood, like the story of Grandmother, that's the one where she does the striptease. That's the one where her grandmother is devoured by a wolf. That's the one where she eats the flesh of her grandmother and drinks her blood. So those aspects of violence and of sexuality and things are there from the very beginning. It's not like they suddenly are an imposition by the 21st century standards of society onto that story. They're things that are in that story already, and they are more likely something that's just being recognized and are bubbling up rather than being successfully suppressed in the way that, say, the Grimm brothers wanted to repress those aspects, especially of sexuality, from the fairy tales when they were writing their versions. So again, it's not that I just wanted to make the point that that these stories are rooted in that in sexuality and in violence. It's just part of them. You can read, there's a really good essay in our textbook, right, the textbook, by Maria Tatar, the editor, called something like The Hardcore of Grimm's Fairy Tales, which is about sex and violence as sort of a root of those stories. So finally, I guess the final comment I would say is that many people were disturbed as well in the Little Red Riding Hood stories about the way that that Roald Dahl and James Thurber turn Little Red Riding Hood from this sort of innocent creature into somebody that's a gun-toting, excuse me, a gun-toting, sort of vigilante or something of the woods, and how horrible that violence is in there. Well, let's think about that for a second. Yeah, it's a gun violence as opposed to an animal, devouring people, which is another kind of violence, or a huntsman coming in and slicing open the belly of a wolf, which is another kind of violence. So it's not like the story was free of violence before, or that the versions that we actually grew up with and things were free of violence. They weren't. So it just comes out in a different way when we look at it, when we see a gun, which is a sort of modern kind of a thing that's imposed on something that we imagine somehow to be taking place in a time before all of that or something like that. Okay. So that's all I have to say about the Little Red Riding Hood stories, and I'm going to quit right now for on this portion and then do a second one about the Beauty and the Beast stories.